today's tutorial, we're going to be making a distortion shader. This is a shader that distorts and modulates and plays with the appearance of the surface. And the reason that we're making a distortion shader is not necessarily because distortion shaders are amazing, but because I want to show you some techniques for manipulating the UV coordinates of the surface. So let's take a look here. In our viewport we have just our sample test cube, and you can see that I have a texture applied to it. So here's our very basic shader. We have our texture sample and we have our texture coordinates wired into the sample. So we're sampling our texture and passing it into both base color and also emissive color. So when we apply that to our cube, we get our texture applied to the surface. And there's nothing necessarily special about this texture. It's just a grid texture where you can see the values from 0 to 1 in the U and from 0 to 1 in the V. So as I said, the purpose of this tutorial is to help you learn how to manipulate UV coordinates. So let's jump right in. The first thing that we're going to do to manipulate our UVs is add to them. So I've got a bunch of nodes down here, and these are the ones that we're going to be going over today. So the first one that we're going to use is add. So if I wire my UV coordinates, and by the way, the data type of this node is a float 2. So I'm going to wire my UV coordinates into my add, and then I'm going to wire the result into my UVs. Now, in order for this to actually change something, I need to add something to it. And what I'm going to add is a constant 2 vector. So I'm going to grab this guy and wire that into the B socket of my add. So I'm adding texture coordinates together with a constant value, and right now my constant is 0, 0. So I'm basically adding nothing, and you can see that nothing is being added. Well, let's come over here to my constant value and change what B is and see what happens. So if I make it 0.1, now what you're going to see is that it moved just a little bit. Can you see how it's no longer going from 0 to 1, but now it's going from 0.1 to 1, and then there's more here at the bottom. So I've changed the B, and what's happening is that, and it takes a minute to compile, so you can't see it instantly, but what's happening is it's slowly scrolling up as I change this value to 0.3 and 0.4, and you can see that as I add more and more, it's scrolling the texture. So adding values to texture coordinates scrolls the texture coordinates. That's the thing that I want you to take away from this. So right now I'm just scrolling it in this vertical dimension, or in the V of the UV coordinates, but I could also scroll them horizontally as well. So here I'll type 0.4 into the U, and now I've scrolled 0.4 horizontally and also 0.4 vertically. Alright, the next thing that we need to do is introduce the concept of time. So here is our time node, and what this node does is it increases linearly. It's a float 1 value, or just a single value that increases linearly as long as your program is running. So every amount of time that your program is running, this value continues to go up and up and up. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my time and I'm just going to wire it directly into my add. So I'm adding time to texture coordinates. And let's take a look and see what happens here. So now you can see that time is making the texture coordinates scroll. And instead of me having to type in a value each time and increase it, time is doing that for me. So as time goes by, it's scrolling more and more and more. And it's scrolling diagonally, you can see. And the reason that it's scrolling diagonally is that time is being added to both U and to V. and it's a uniform addition. But this isn't exactly the effect that we're going for. We want a little bit more control over how this works. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a multiply. So a little bit more math here. And we're going to multiply time by a value. Let's use our float2 value here, and I'm going to wire that in. And so I'm going to multiply time by a value, and then I'm going to add it. And I'm just going to change this value over here to 0.0, and then I'm going to add that to my UV coordinates. And you're going to notice two things. First of all, the scrolling is much slower than it used to be, and second, it's only scrolling in one direction. So it's slower because previously time was going at a speed of 1, and now that I've multiplied it by 0.4, it's going at a speed of 0.4, so I've slowed it down. And I can make it go even slower if I were to come over here and change this to like 0.1, for example. And then secondly, it's only scrolling in one dimension because I'm multiplying the u by 0.1 and the v by 0. So if you multiply something by 0, it makes it 0, which means my v coordinate is not scrolling at all, and my u coordinate is scrolling by 0.1. Let's set the u coordinate to scroll by 0 and the v to scroll by 0.4, just to see as an illustration of how this works. So my first value here controls the u scrolling, and my second value controls the v scrolling. Alright, so now what you're seeing is that I'm able to control the scrolling of the coordinate using time, and I'm able to control the time using multiply by a constant value. Now the next thing that we're going to do is a little bit tricky, so I want to take a minute to explain what we're going to do. I want to adjust my UV coordinates. Right now I'm adjusting them uniformly, so every UV coordinate here gets the same adjustment. But what I want to do is to be able to offset my UV coordinates, but offset them by a different amount for every pixel. And in order to do that, I need to introduce some noise, or I need to use a texture with some noise in it. So here's the texture that I created. And basically what I did is to create this is I went into Photoshop and I used the render clouds function, and then I created a red, a green, and a blue, different tilings and offsets of the noise, and then I put them in different channels. So this is what the red channel looks like, this is what the green channel looks like, and this is what the blue channel looks like. So you can see that each of the channels contains tiling noise, but the noise pattern is different. So when you put them all together, they create this crazy clown color, but it's not the color that I'm interested in, more that I'm interested in the different data in each of the channels separately. So let's go back to our shader, and you can see here if I just take this texture sample, and let's say I want to wire, and then I want to use the red channel. Let's say I just wire that directly in, and so the red channel of my shader will look like this. But this isn't a texture that I'm going to use directly and wire into the root. It's a texture that I'm going to use to manipulate my UV coordinates. So let's go back to what we had before. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my red and my green, and I'm going to append those. So I'm going to use this append node. And what this does is it turns red and green into a float2, where red is in the first channel and green is in the second channel. Now let's see what happens if I add this value to my texture coordinates. So I'm going to put time aside here for a minute, and I'm going to append, or I'm going to add this value directly to my texture coordinate. And let's just see what happens to my, oh my goodness, look at that. That is crazy. Did you see what happened? What's happening here is every pixel in my, and let's go back to the texture for a minute. Every pixel in my noise texture is a different grayscale value. So I have some pixels that are black and some pixels that are white and pixels that are everywhere in between. And these values are getting added to my UV coordinates. So the white or the red channel is getting added to the U coordinate, and the green channel is getting added to the V coordinate. So in each pixel of my image, the UV coordinates are being offset by the red and the green values that are in this noise texture. And you can see that the amount of noise here is crazy, and that's because these values range between 0 and 1. And so I'm offsetting the UV coordinates by up to a full 0 to 1 range, and that is way too much. So in order to control that a little bit, what I want to do is multiply. I'm going to take a multiply here. And what I want to do is just tone this value down. So instead of being super strong like it is now, I'm going to multiply it by, let's say, 0.03, just so it's going to be a really small number, and then I'm going to wire that into add. So instead of ranging from 0 to 1, now my offset values are ranging from 0 to 0.03. And if you take a look here, it looks like I just wiggled my texture, and it's a really interesting effect. So every pixel is being offset just a little bit. So before sampling my texture, I'm taking my texture coordinates and I'm wiggling them, or I'm distorting them with this cool noise texture. Alright, let's take this a little bit further. What if we want to, so we've got static distortion now, but what if we wanted to actually animate this distortion? Well, we need to use our scrolling that we were doing before, but instead of scrolling this texture, we need to scroll this texture. So I'm going to take my texture coordinates, and I'm going to come over here to my noise or my distortion texture, and we need to take our scrolling that we had and we need to add it to these texture coordinates. So let's create, or let's copy this add, and we'll bring it over here. So we have our texture coordinates. We're going to wire that in, and then we're going to take our time and wire that in. And I like to keep my nodes kind of compressed or close together. Some people like to spread these nodes out a little bit, but my style is to kind of keep them close together without overlapping, but just kind of grouped up nicely like this. Okay, now I'm going to wire this directly into our noise texture, and what this is doing is it's scrolling the distortion texture. Actually, before we do this, you can see that we're getting some nice distortion, but I want to show you just briefly what this is doing to the texture itself. We're just doing scrolling like we had before. So here's our texture, and it's scrolling vertically. But instead of passing this texture directly into our root node, we're using this vertical scrolling value to offset the texture coordinates for this other texture. It's kind of an interesting concept. So I'm just going to wire this back in so you can see what's going on. And so if you look, you can see that we have this pattern scrolling through, and it's offsetting the texture coordinates of our original texture. But if you look carefully enough, if you watch this for a minute, you can see there's a repetitive pattern, right? So we have, if you look right here over here, you can see this column, and it just keeps on repeating, and it's doing it over and over and over again. And generally in computer graphics, we want to try to avoid repetitive patterns because they just kind of get... We want to avoid repetitive patterns because they just repeat and they look, I don't know, they just don't look as nice. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to find a way to prevent this this distortion effect from repeating so much. So we need to make some room here. I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. I'm going to move this over here. And okay, so what we need to do is actually scroll 2 copies of this texture across each other. One in one direction and the other in another direction. And if we change the rate of speed that they're scrolling and the direction that they're scrolling in, we can break up this tiling pattern and make it imperceptible so that you can't tell that there's any sort of repetition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take this whole chunk and copy and paste it. So now we have 2 of these happening. And I'm going to just make a little bit of space so that we can add in a couple of more nodes. Now, in order to take both of these and combine their results together, I need to move them over just a little bit. So I'm going to move them over here. And what we're going to do is I need another append node for this one down here. So for this one, I'm going to be using the red and the blue channel just for a little bit more variety. And now I'm going to take the result of both of these and add them together. So let's take an add node again. So I'll add the top one and the bottom one. And then I'll take the result of that and pass that into my multiply. So I'm sampling this texture and I'm also sampling this texture and adding the result together. Now right now they're both scrolling at a rate of 0 on the U and 0.4 on the Y. So we need to mix these values up a little bit. And I've already created 2 nodes that have the values in them that I like, so I'm just going to use these. So I'll wire the first one into my first texture sampler here, and the second one into my second texture sampler here. And I'll remove these other ones and just kind of clean things up a little bit. And now what you can see is this first one, I'm scrolling at a rate of 0.34 and 0.12. And then the second one, 0.13 and 0.26. So you can see the scrolling is happening at slightly different rates and slightly different directions. And the result of this and combining these 2 textures together is that we get a distortion pattern that doesn't loop anymore. Like if we look closely at this, because things are happening at different speeds, it's not possible to make out a tiling pattern anymore, and we can just watch this forever and it doesn't repeat. And that's the result that we want. Okay, so you could use this distortion idea if you were making, if you put this on a particle system and you wanted to make heat haze coming from a fire, for example, you could use that. Or you could use this for refraction if there's some water, some rippling water on your surface. Or you could use this for, I don't know, if you just wanted to make some kind of alien material that looked like it was wiggling. So you could use distortion for a lot of things. But that wasn't necessarily the reason that I wanted to show you this. The most important thing is that we learn that we can, instead of just passing our texture coordinates directly into our texture samples, before we do that, we can do all kinds of things with them. We can add them, which makes them scroll. We can multiply them, which makes them scale. Or we can offset them using textures per pixel, so we can get different amounts of offset, and that makes them appear distorted. So, pretty cool. I hope you learned some things. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel. I've got a bunch more videos coming, and I hope to be able to share some really cool shader techniques with you and help you on your journey as you learn how to create shaders.